Perfect. And so we're going to kind of continue along that same theme, but now we're going to go into that I guess you can say psyche of the business or the organization and look at the good and bad. Why would they want to hire an independent contractor? Why might they want to hire an employee? And, making sure with this whole thing that we're keeping correct with those definitions. So let's just look at it from the business standpoint. From the standpoint of the business or the organization, we're going to say, well, what is the good and bad, those pros and cons of hiring an independent contractor? Well, first of all, they could have some cost savings. They can save money by not having to pay those benefits or taxes. What about the added advantage of not having to pay a full-time employee when they're not needing them? So they're really only paying for the hours that they're needing this person there. Great staffing flexibility because they can hire just for a specific need, just for times or skills that are necessary and not, again, paying for time that's unnecessary. The liability aspect of it, it can be a potential reduction in their own exposure to lawsuits because they spread the liability out to others, being this other business owner, this contractor. There's a better potential for flat fees that can help them control their own project costs. They may even be able to get extended terms for payment. So what I mean by that is if you're working with a business or contractor, you might be able to get 30 days, maybe even 45 days, where if you're paying an employee, you have to, rigid like clockwork, pay them exactly when it's due, regardless of if you have the money at that time. You also may be able to have less worry. As independent contractors really generally don't attempt to form unions, and you really don't have the same instances of discrimination issues with contractors. So on the pro side, we know this is what our client's thinking about. They're like, I don't want to pay those taxes and those benefits, and there's all these great things about having a contractor. This can be very legitimate reasons. But we have to look instantly at the other side of that coin too and say, well, what are the disadvantages? First of all is they have less control. Technically, if they are, and we're talking about the true definitions of an independent contractor, they have less control over the worker. And the actual individual performing the work might actually vary because a true independent contractor, they can substitute somebody else in, maybe one of their own staff or employees, to do whatever that contract work is. And sometimes the right to fire them will depend on their written agreement. So you may not even have the control of being able to say, what, I'm done. Nope, actually, you have to do this according to the terms of this written contract. So there's a lot less control from the standpoint of the business that's hiring the contractor. The other thing is really when we come down to business knowledge, a contractor may not understand the business nearly as well as an employee in the terms of they don't understand it fully as an employee that's working in-house. They also may not have the same loyalty to the business. So having a lack of loyalty to the organization is just because that contractor is really more for their own interests and not for the company interests, let's say, because they're not an employee. They're just a contractor. Ownership, here's something that is different is think about in that contractor sense, they get to own the copyrights or the works created, and the business that hires them normally can't own the rights of those created works. So it is a definite difference between the contractor and the employee. If we look at audits and risks, there's a definite risk of increased government audits from the IRS, from labor boards, from OSHA, and from others because they know this is an area, unfortunately, that has a lot of abuse. That a lot of organizations are tempted to call everybody independent contractors, so just by the nature of that, it could just prompt a question. You also have the possibility, it's usually the worker that will generate a lot of those kind of reviews in those different organizations. So there is a higher risk. If they are a true legitimate contractor, though, then you shouldn't have to worry as much. But there are increased risks from all those different agencies. You also have to worry about confidentiality and privacy. Higher risks regarding those issues because somebody who is an employee will generally, you don't have as much of a worry about confidentiality issues or privacy issues working for your company as a general contractor, even their staff. There's also the injured worker that might prompt an investigation for workers' compensation and some potential liability in that area. If you weren't able to prove that they had their own coverage ahead of time, it still can revert, even in a true independent contractor case, back to the person that's hiring them. So there is, a good side of having an independent contractor and certainly a bad side of that coin that we want to make sure that our potential employers, our potential business owners are aware of. And that's again, part of our job when we're helping to educate any of our business owners. So what is it from the other side, from that person who's working? What are some of those advantages and disadvantages of actually being an independent contractor? And they're going to parallel quite a few of the ways that I just mentioned. But if we look at control, a lot of everything, again, it's going to come around to control. That contractor is going to be free to set their own rules. And in fact, if you think of that, their income is limited only by their bargaining power, their own skills. So it's kind of like they have a better opportunity as an independent contractor. They have that opportunity to be the boss and not answer to a supervisor. I mean, they're still under a contract to perform a certain job, but here is a true business owner in the sense of an independent contractor. They have greater potential. They can build and lead their own organization and potentially have unlimited earnings depending on their own energy and their own abilities. They can also duplicate their efforts by teaching others to do their work and get even more accomplished. It allows, with ownership, anything they create, those copyrights, those patents, they get to usually retain the rights of those created works. And they don't have to really be concerned with petty office politics and drama, or at least not as much usually. They get to be paid more than an employee would for similar work, and they have good flexibility. They get to take and have a flexible work schedule. They get to possibly make, deductions they wouldn't have, vehicle deductions, maybe office and home. They get to set their own pricing. They can work from home even, and maybe they want to have flexibility of part-time or different work hours. So there's a lot of flexibility for that independent contractor. As we mentioned, that they may have more flexibility than an employee for ability to take deductions against their business earnings. They may be able to even set more aside in a tax-deferred retirement account. So this is truly structured for an independent contractor is a business owner, so they get some of those advantages, you can say, as a business owner. On the other side of the coin, well, they also have a bad side of that, is they don't have job security. I mean, if you think of just a loss of a couple clients can have a very significant effect on the livelihood for a lot of contractors unless they develop a reasonably large network of clients. There's also a risk for them. It's not the same as an employee. They actually may not get paid, or they may not get paid timely. So that can be a real detriment for a contractor. The biggie is that they are subject to self-employment tax. They have more complex tax returns. They may even have sales taxes they have to deal with. So their tax situation suddenly becomes a lot more complex. They are also potentially liable for business debts, where if they're just an employee, they don't carry any of that liability. They don't really have any employer-provided benefits, and they have to cover those costs themselves if they want those kind of benefits. They may not have unemployment insurance or workers' compensation insurance unless they cover that cost themselves. They have a much greater responsibility for accounting, maintaining their own bookkeeping records, and like we said, more complex tax returns. They have to make estimated tax payments quarterly. They will have to maintain separate bank accounts, mileage records. There's a lot more record keeping that can be very burdensome for an independent contractor. So, which we also say, okay, what about other types of expenses? Yeah, absolutely. Even though they may on the surface think they're getting more money, they maybe have increased costs because now they're paying insurance for themselves. They can also make a bad decision and lose money. As we mentioned, it's the ability, which we say, as we get into the IRS factors and the court factors, if they have the ability for loss. It's called risk of loss. They mess up and quote something terribly. They thought it was going to take 2 hours and it ended up taking 200 hours. They will lose money, and that's a risk a contractor has where employees don't really carry that risk. They have to actually do two things. They have to market themselves in order to have the jobs, to earn the income, and actually do the work itself. So they have to become able to multitask, wear multiple hats in order to earn the money that they need to. They have to deal with their own OSHA requirements. They may have significant investment in tools and equipment and facilities and inventory. So it's a different thing for an independent contractor to be as successful at this because their burden is, it puts them in the same area as that business owner that's hiring them, a lot of those same requirements. So this is the good and bad of being the independent contractor. So we can have a better understanding of what might be the motivating factors for our clients at times. All right. And a lot of this, the takeaway is that we have opportunity here as accountants. We have, just by having a better understanding, we can really be in that position to help our clients, and we may be able to certainly have revenue from this particular niche area of saying, like you were mentioning a second ago, Jeff, is there's accountants that can help and say, hey, I know you have all these different little independent contractor businesses you're running, and some of it is people are doing that just to try to survive their own day-to-day. So there's definite opportunity there. But we have to be aware of the misclassification liabilities and the penalties and what can happen if they're falling under that temptation. I'm going to go ahead and call them an independent contractor. You know what? I don't want to deal with all that extra stuff. Here can be what happens to them. This is part of our, not that we're scaring our clients, but it's our job to also train them, to teach them. The liability for misclassification is usually in two primary areas, certainly. We have the federal area, and that if they deem it to be intentional, saying you knew that you weren't supposed to do this, but you just disregarded it anyway because you were lazy or you just didn't want to deal with the rules, they're going to have to pay the full portion. That's employer and employee share of the FICA taxes. You go, wait a second, well, that employer didn't have the advantage of taking that out of the employee's checks. Yeah, that's right. They're going to still pay the whole portion, the employer plus the employee share of the FICA. And they're not allowed to deduct or recover any portion of that from the employee. So that becomes the liability aspect of it, is the whole share, the whole 15.3% of every dollar that they've paid them. In addition to the FICA taxes, the IRS is also going to collect federal unemployment taxes from that employer as well. And penalties and interest for those late payments will also be charged. So here's the liability. If they kind of go trudging ahead saying, you know, I'm going to put the blinders on and pretend like maybe this person isn't an employee, after an investigation, which even could be launched quite often, truthfully, by a miscreditable employee, they start an investigation. They say, okay, well, here you've got to pay the full share of FICA. You've got to pay the full amount of federal employment and interest and penalties. And this is only the federal side. So that's only like part of what we have to worry about. What's going to happen to them next is on their state side. That can vary from state to state. And just to kind of give you, I guess, a frame of reference within my home state, since I know it really well, I'm using it as the example. So normally we're dealing with like a Department of Labor in most states out there. That's the division that's in charge of it. So using Colorado as my example, our Department of Labor, in our state, the employees or the contractors, they have a right that they can file a complaint. And then the Department of Labor and Employment is required to accept those complaints and conduct an investigation. No matter if they're frivolous, if they're silly, if they're fraudulent, they're still going to do an investigation. What they've done in the meantime, too, is increase substantially the penalties in this state. So saying, okay, well, if they find out you really weren't treating them properly as an employee, you'll have to pay all those back taxes owed, and they're going to just charge you a extra bonus penalty. So if it's your first offense, they'll say, oh, it's $5,000. Or if it's a second, or they said, you know what, not only did you do this the first time and we picked on you, but you did this a second time, they're going to, of course, make you pay the back taxes, but then they're going to tack on a $25,000 penalty on top of that. So the states, a lot of them are very similar sort of mindsets. They're serious about not having these misclassified workers as well. So you're not just dealing with federal issues. Keep in mind you may be dealing with a state issue depending on your state, and some of them are even harsher than Colorado that came up with the way they wanted to go about it.